Twilight was at the highest point of the Crystal Palace. She was trapped in the center due to the security alarm that the shadowy figure of the former king set many years prior. She had tried to escape by using her teleportation, but Sombra had thought ahead and had placed a spell in the trap so that no pony would be able to teleport out of it. The crystal heart was laying flat on the floor, a few feet away from where Twilight remained incarcerated. If only she hadn't had pushed Spike away, he would have been a huge asset with helping get the hearts of the crystal ponies. But of course, she had decided to follow Celestia's instructions exactly. "In the end, it must be you and you alone," she had told her earlier that day. And now, because of her stubbornness and her sister-in-law's magic fading faster than ever before, the entire empire will return to being enslaved once more. And Twilight was certain that this time, she, her friends, her brother, and Princess Cadance will soon join them. Through a small opening in her little crystal cell, Twilight could see that Cadance's magic had faded. The once clear blue sky was replaced by the dark and snowy tundra. She could hear the screams of many of the local citizens of the Crystal Empire. All of them, she assumed, running toward where the Crystal Heart usually stood. By the time all of them made it to the location of where the heart would be, King Sombra had entered the kingdom. A giant platform made of crystal rose from the ground, his body now returning to its former glory. No longer a shadow, but now a full-fledged unicorn. A unicorn wearing his crown and his red cape once more after 1,000 years. The main five, Spike, Shining Armor, and his wife watched in fear alongside the crystal ponies. King Sombra had finally returned. His horn had begun to glow a dark shade of emerald green. He looked up, staring at the highest point of the castle where the crystal heart laid. The magic had engulfed him, teleporting him off of the platform he had been standing on and into the tower. The purple unicorn was taken aback when a sudden flash of light suddenly came out of nowhere, nearly blinding her. After a few seconds, Twilight rubbed her eyes with her hooves. Her eyes became blurry as they were adjusting themselves from the light. Once her vision had cleared, a look of great horror took over her face as she saw none other than King Sombra right in front of where she was imprisoned. However, he wasn't looking directly at her. No, his eyes were fixated on the heart. The tip of his curved horn began to form a little orb of dark green magic. Her eyes widened as she quickly realized what he was about to do.
"No!"
Twilight shouted, but it was too late. A sharp burst of his magic hit the heart like a laser, destroying it into millions of pieces. Twilight's hooves covered her mouth. Tears were forming in her eyes. A lump began to form in her throat, nearly causing her to choke. She soon began to regret her little outburst from a few moments ago, when the Unicorn King looked her direction. Her surroundings then began to shake and dissipate, releasing her. There Twilight stood in front of the evil monarch. She would have teleported away from him, but she was too afraid. Plus, she was pretty sure that if she were to teleport, he would do the same. The stallion stepped toward her, his red eyes never looking away from her violet ones. The purple smoke from his peripherals, along with his mane and tail, began to flow more rapidly as he walked toward the mare. The closer he got to her, the more she feared for her life. Her eyes began to burn, for she had not blinked since he first laid his eyes on her. Her heart began to beat fast. It was so quick that she thought it would explode inside of her body, which would leave her to die from bleeding internally. She surely thought that was going to happen once he had put his hoof underneath her chin, causing her to look at him. Twilight hesitated.
What do you want from me?"
The purple mare grimaced. She then felt something heavy around her neck and hooves. One of her eyes popped open and looked down, seeing shackles and chains upon herself. Not only that, but her chains seemed to be different from the rest of the ponies down below. Her own shackles were attached to the demon himself. She had found herself frozen when she heard the king speak. Her eyes stared into his once more.
"What I want is a queen."
Twilight didn't say a word. She just kept staring into his red, possessive eyes. For a split second, she could have sworn she saw some type of sparkle appearing in his pupils. And the longer she stared, the more that her own eyes became like his. Two years. It had been 2 years since King Sombra had returned and had successfully taken over the Crystal Empire. All of the Crystal Ponies, the main 5, Spike, and the Prince and his Princess had been in chains, forced to do labor for the King and his newly refound Queen. But it was just Princess Cadance now, locked in her own little cell with shackles still around her hooves. She was curled into a fetal position, the same way she had laid herself every night since King Sombra had imprisoned her, her loved ones, and her citizens. Every night she did nothing but lay herself in that exact position, crying herself to sleep. Her multicolored mane was disheveled and faded. Her body was dirty from the amount of labor she was forced to do, and her chains and neck brace had left deep scars in her fur coat and skin. She was all alone. No pony to keep her company. No pony to put a smile on her face. All due to the others, one by one, slowly becoming executed. First Spike, then Fluttershy, and then Pinkie Pie, and so on until they reached her husband a few months back. Pretty soon, she will be gone as well. Half of her was happy. No longer would she be tortured and alone. She wouldn't be miserable anymore. But the other half of her didn't want to go. She wanted to try to find a way to still save her rightful kingdom. She was supposed to rule and protect it. After all, her cutie mark was the image of the Crystal Heart. However, the heart was gone, destroyed by the tyrant. Without the heart, there was no way possible that she or any of the Crystal Ponies would defeat him, thus making her weak and vulnerable. Not even the simplest of magic would do her any good. Cadance's ears suddenly perked up as she heard the sound of hoofsteps coming down into the corridor. She lifted her head, staring at the door in front of her. She listened to the tumblers as whoever was on the other side began to open it. The door opened to reveal the silhouette of a stallion that seemed to be completely made of crystal. He wasn't exactly a crystal pony, but he was also certainly not a regular stallion. Cadance recognized him immediately, and knew what was about to happen. The stallion, whom was dressed in royal guard apparel, lowered his head, taking her chains in his mouth. He gave her an intense look, his eyebrows furrowing together. She would have glared at him, but she was too distraught to do so. The Princess of Love struggled to get up, for the shackles on her hooves were pulling her down due to the heftiness. Not only that, but she was pretty malnourished. She didn't have that much energy in her body to do anything. After a few attempts of trying, she was finally up on all fours. Although, when she was standing, you could see that she was looking pretty thin, being that her ribcage was showing. The guard yanked her chains a bit, gesturing her to come with him.
No use resisting him,
she thought. She began to take a few steps toward who she now realized was an earth pony, her weak legs only having enough energy to go so far. The moment she had gotten beside the guard, she collapsed. He let out a grunt as he caught the mare's body onto his own back. The alicorn may have been thin due to the lack of being fed, but the metal and steel that was attached to her has added quite a bit of weight. The stallion, with Princess Cadance on his body, began to walk out of the dungeon, but not without closing her cell door. He carried her throughout the halls of the palace, only taking her off of his backside and holding her by the waist for support when they were going upstairs. Finally, after ages of walking through countless hallways and stairs that seemed to be thousands of steps or more, the two were now where they were meant to be, the king and queen's throne room. The guard set the still unconscious mare gently onto the cold tile floor. He looked over, feeling bad for her. She looked so fragile. Without a warning, a booming voice called out to the earth pony.
"What is it, son?"
They asked. The sudden burst of a voice caused the stallion to jump a little. He was going to call out for the king. He didn't expect for him to already be out. The guard cleared his throat before speaking.
"Oh, I've brought the princess as you requested, your majesty."
King Sombra raised an eyebrow. He looked down a bit to the guard's left to see the sleeping mare on the ground beside him. He gave him an approving, yet vicious smile.
"Well done,"
he said. He gave his supreme a tiny nod. The Unicorn King took a few steps toward the two of them. The young stallion was sweating nervously as he stood directly in front of him. The king glanced down at the sleeping princess.
"Leave us."
The earth pony nodded, saluting him before leaving the room. Sombra waited until the guard was completely out of sight.
"Princess Miamure Cadenza,"
he said, snarling at the name, for just saying it tasted like bile. The princess's eyes fluttered open at the sound of her full name being called, despite it being said with no good intentions coming her way. Her eyes looked up from where she was lying. She wasn't surprised that it was none other than the king looking down at her. Cadence knew that she was going to face him sooner or later.
Yes.
She responded weakly, licking her dry lips.
"Do you know what today is?"
He asked, pacing before her. Cadence got up from the floor, using as much of her strength as she could.
I believe I can come up with a pretty good answer. Your Majesty.
King Sombra raised an eyebrow at the alicorn.
"And what would that be?"
She tried to give him a sort of a scowl, but failed. Instead, she decided to give him an answer.
The day where you finally end my pain and misery.
She replied, her legs shaking. He turned toward her, surprised, but at the same time, delighted. The stallion walked in front of her, placing his hoof underneath her chin, chuckling. A confused expression spread across her face.
What's so funny?
"Oh, I'm not the one who plans to end your misery,"
he said, making air quotes with his forehoofs.
What are you talking about?
Sombra smiled a wicked smile.
"Darling,
He called out.
would you come out here, please?"
Not too far from behind them came a unicorn mare. Upon her body was a purple cape and a silver crown, similar to her lover's on top of the front of her hair, which seemed to be in some sort of perm. The tip of her horn was tinted red as well, much like Sombra's, and her eyes were red with a purple mist flowing out from her peripherals, again much like the king's. Cadence could not believe her eyes. It couldn't be who she thought it was. She thought she was dead. She was told she was dead. But she could recognize those eyes in Maine anywhere. Here she was making her way towards her and the tyrant that caused her and every pony in the empire nothing but pain. What made it even more unbelievable was that she was now bound to him.
Hello, my dear.
She greeted him. Sombra smiled at her, giving her a full kiss on the lips. Cadence's eyes widened, completely stunned. After their lips had parted, his lover had looked the weak mare into the eyes.
Twilight.
Cadence said in a whisper. The queen gave her a short nod, confirming her identity. Due to the news, Cadence's leg finally gave out, making her collapse once more.
I thought you were dead.
She said, her voice now very raspy.
We all thought you were dead. Oh no, Cadence. I'm very much alive. However, you won't be much longer.
Cadence watched as the king wrapped his arm around Twilight's waist.
No, this can't be true.
This isn't like you. He's controlling you. He has to be.
Oh, sis.
She began.
Sombra isn't controlling me.
Her horn began to glow, dark green magic with specks of dark purple and black beginning to form along with it.
It's just that I've simply had a loss of heart.
Cadence's eyes began to swell up in tears, crying one last and final time.